You're listening to episode 54 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Toni Bernhard talks about her book, How to Be Sick, a Buddhist-inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers. Raise your hand if you've ever gotten a cold, felt run down, had no energy. You've got the crud that's been going around the office. Of course, we've all been sick in this way at some time in our lives. But even that place of NyQuil-besotted sniffing and drowsiness, we've never really questioned whether or not we'd get better. We know we will. It just doesn't typically come up as something to think about. And this confidence is one of the unsung heroes of making our illness tolerable. But what if the discomfort, the lack of energy, the sick feeling of something being wrong, what if that doesn't go away? What if you find yourself ill with no prospect of getting better? We think that, as Buddhist practitioners who are well versed in the signs the Buddha is said to have seen during his daring sojourn away from the palace, sickness is something we can handle. And sure, we can. We've got the deck stacked in our favor, and we know we're going to feel better. It can be more challenging when our physical suffering is ongoing and isn't going to get better. How we address this, how we learn from it, how we resolve to take the opportunity to really experience this teaching during the harder times when we're not in our comfortable sangha and the only pain we have is in our knees for an hour, that's where we can also make tremendous progress. Toni Bernhard became ill while a university law professor in the prime of her career. She tells the reader how she got sick and, to her and her partner's bewilderment, stayed that way. Toni had been a long-time meditator, going on long meditation retreats and spending many hours rigorously practicing, but soon discovered that she simply could no longer engage in those difficult and taxing forms. She had to learn ways to make being sick the heart of her spiritual practice, and through truly learning how to be sick, she learned how, even with many physical and energetic limitations, to live a life of equanimity, compassion, and joy. And whether we ourselves are sick now or not, we can learn these vital arts of living from her book, How to Be Sick. So, sit back, relax, and have some sleepy time tea, because there's very little more comforting when you're not feeling well. Our guest today is Toni Bernhard. Toni, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Very glad to. The book we're speaking about is called How to Be Sick, a Buddhist-inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers. And that's one of the things I'll want to get into in our discussion, is that, in particular, that part of the subtitle. But I wanted you first to chat about how you came to have a Buddhist practice before the book or anything else came about.
Well, it was in about 1992, so almost 20 years ago. My husband and I were studying the Tao Te Ching, and we had several different translations, and I got a hold of one by Stephen Mitchell. And I found myself, my background is in academia, so like a lot of academics, I always go to the footnotes. And I found myself looking at the footnotes more than at the text. And he kept, citing a Zen teacher, Master Sung San, who had a Zen practice, I think it's in Providence, Rhode Island, a Korean Zen master who died some years ago. And he kept quoting him. And I was more attracted to these quotes than to the text, although the text was wonderful too. And I wrote a letter to Stephen Mitchell. And he wrote back to me, and he saw where I lived in Davis, California. And he said, you know, I wrote about my interest in Buddhism. And he said, you really need to start a practice. It's the same. I remember his saying that it's as if looking at a painting of fruit is not the same as eating the fruit.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And he said he would recommend that I either find John Tarrant, a Zen teacher in Sonoma County, or Jack Cornfield at a place called Spirit Rock in Marin County. And honestly, Marin County was closer to me than Sonoma County. It was that simple a decision. And I can't remember how I found my way there, because that was before you just would go to the internet and, Google Spirit Rock. But I wound up going there on a Saturday for a day long, and the two teachers happened to be Sharon Salzberg and Sylvia Borston. Yeah. And lucky me, and I was just hooked. And so my practice became really Theravadan or Vipassana meditation, simply because that's the tradition of Spirit Rock. But I love reading Buddhist books, so I've read in all the traditions, and in the book How to Be Sick, I draw on all the traditions. But that's how I came to be. That's how Spirit Rock came to be my spiritual home.
Yeah, it's interesting that a lot of these themes come up in the book itself. That you don't limit yourself just to Theravada practice. That you do bring in Zen phrases and ways of looking at things that really contribute to the overall effectiveness of how you address the topic.
Yeah, well, when before I got sick, and now that since 2001, when I got sick, it's hard for me to read, and so really all the books that I use in How to Be Sick are the oldies but goodies, because they're books that I read and had marked up and taken notes on sometime between 1992 and 2001. Those are the books that I got down and the notebooks I got out. And during that period, I just couldn't read enough Buddhism. And so I have dozens of, a lot of the books I took out of the library at UC Davis, and then if I really wanted it, I'd buy it on, well, probably not online, but however you bought books then.
Back in the old days.
Yeah. So I have dozens of Zen books. I mean, not dozens, but, enough. And Tibetan books I loved reading. And what I would do, I found that each of these three major traditions, there's a dozen other traditions too, but each of these three traditions has its own flavor. And so I would read, the Theravadan books, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Cornfield, Buddhadasa, and I'd think, it's Achan Cha and Achan Sumera. I'd think, it's kind of dry. I need something more punchy. And so then I'd go get on a Zen kick. And so then I'd read the Zen books for a while, Robert Aitken and Joko Beck. I loved their writings, even though sometimes I don't understand Zen, but that's okay.
That's okay,
yeah. Yeah, and then I would feel, I want something really spiritual, really ethereal and otherworldly, and I'd start reading in the Tibetan stuff. And, one mind and clear mind and, poetic. And after immersing myself in that for a while, I'd think, I'm ready for just my plain old Theravadan practice again. And then I'd go back to the Theravadan books. So it's true. That's the way I kind of rotated among the three traditions. And so there's a Tibetan practice in the book, Tonglen, and there's a chapter on Zen, and a lot of Zen teachers throughout the book. I should also mention Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah.
He may be mentioned in the book more than anybody, if I did a count, which I haven't done a count, but
I think you're right. He is in there a lot, and it's funny that you mentioned kind of cycling through the different big three traditions that we do that based on what appeals at the moment. And that's not a problem. A question came up in a class that I was in last week about your meditation practice, and that, do we just do this or we just do that? And really what you need to do is switch it up to keep it fresh. What is going to work for you in the particular circumstances you're in at that moment? It doesn't mean you take whatever's the easiest route, but it does mean that you need to freshen your mind sometimes as you're training it.
And I think I use the reading that way to keep inspiring me, to inspire me to keep going by hearing yet another slant on the Dharma. Yeah. So
as time went on, your background when you were growing up, you were, generally speaking, healthy and hale, correct?
I was. I didn't have any health problems.
So what changed? Tell us the story.
Well, I was a law professor at UC Davis, and I had in the 90s, I'm just setting up why I was so happy at the time that I got sick. In the 90s, for 6 years, I served as the dean of students at the law school, and within a couple years went quite gray. I mean, that's a tough job. And so in 1998, I felt I'd done my duty, and kind of faculty rotate through those who are willing. And I went back to teaching. And so that was in 98. And I was just thrilled. I was teaching all the subjects I wanted to. And 2001 came, and my husband and I were celebrating 30 years of being married. And we decided to do something special and go to Paris. We are not world travelers, so this was something really special. And we decided rather than travel around, we would just stay in Paris for 3 weeks and immerse ourselves in the culture. And so I did find a little studio apartment online by 2001. That's how you could do it. And we flew to Paris. And on the second day there, I felt sick. And I thought it was probably jet lag, and so I ignored it. But by the third day, I was clearly sick with something. I had fever, sore throat, all the acute type symptoms of a bad flu. And so I took to the bed, and we said, well, that's okay. We'll have 2.5 weeks in Paris. And then 2.5 became 2, and 2 became 1.5. I just couldn't throw this flu off. And I saw a doctor there who said, well, I think it's just the flu. She called it la grippe. I actually, toward the end of the trip, I began to feel better, and I thought, that was Paris. My husband, poor guy, wandered the streets by himself, and which he doesn't really like. He likes my company out in the world.
Yeah, of course.
But he was on his own. And we came back to Davis, and I had a relapse. But again, I seemed to get better. And by now it was July, and the the law school starts up in August, but I thought I would be fine. And then I actually went on a retreat at Spirit Rock in the middle of July, a treasured retreat when Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg come from the East Coast, and it's their annual trip to Spirit Rock, and it's a lottery system to get in. And I went on the retreat on a Friday, and Monday morning couldn't get out of bed. I felt like I'd been hit by a Mack truck. I don't know how else to describe it. I'm sorry, I'm going to clear my throat. And it wasn't, this was different. This was not the acute symptoms of flu, no sore throat and fever and cough, but a sickly flu-like fatigue, the kind of fatigue you have when you're sick, which is the side effects of your body fighting off whatever it is you have. And it's now almost 10 years later, and that's the way I still am. I'm using adrenaline, which is what I use when I need to get through. I'm using adrenaline to have the energy to speak to you, and I'm happy to do that because I want to be able to do that. But I've never gotten well.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that many people don't understand, I think, is that it isn't simply a matter of you got sick and then we get better. That's typically our experience with it. We get a head cold and we get better. We break a leg skiing and we get better. And there's getting better becomes a part of it. But what's very challenging with what you're struggling with is not only has there been some challenges with diagnosis, and you can talk a little bit about that part, but there's also, it's not a visible thing like a cast. You're not sniffling. It's not a visible, tangible thing for people. And the third part that makes this very hard is you're not getting better. And people they don't know how to deal with that. How have people been reacting to you? What changes have occurred? And you mentioned some of this in the book, but I want you to talk about it here.
Well, it's something that that all chronically ill people have to learn to handle, and that's the fact that when you get sick or you develop some kind of disabling condition, people are very helpful. And at first our refrigerator was filled with all the food that people brought, but they expect you to get better, and you expect yourself to get better. And when it doesn't happen, friends react differently. Some of them don't hang around. I've lost many of my close friends. And at first I was very bitter about it, but I've come to understand that some people are very uncomfortable around illness or anything not being right about the body. It may reflect their own fears, but they're just uncomfortable about it. And other people, they don't have the patience to understand that you may make arrangements to see them and then have to cancel at the last minute if that's a day you can't get out of bed. And then it's also true that the more you live in isolation, the less you have in common with people, So I went through a very dark period in the early years when I just didn't understand why some of my friends just stopped coming around. Now, others didn't. I have a dear friend who is very flexible, and if she's happy that if we make plans and if I can't keep them, that's fine with her. She'll do something else and come another day. But I've discovered through my internet wanderings and connecting with lots of other chronically ill people that this is very common. People say things like, all my friends went missing. People really, it's like another illness you have to deal with. Mm-hmm. First you have the illness itself, and then you have the effect of the illness on your social life and your relationship to the world. And in many ways, it's more devastating than the illness itself.
It is, and I think very much so. And having many of the listeners of the podcast know that I've had chronic health issues my whole life, so really it was no surprise or change for me. It was something I grew up with. But for you, this is very different. There was a whole adjustment to make to having a chronic illness, and then the impact it had on your social structure.
Yeah, I've in these 10 years, I've known people. Actually, a friend of mine was in a terrible auto accident about a month ago, and I talked to her on the phone when she was home from the hospital, and we joked about the fact that right now she was worse off than I am, but in another 2 months she'll be better off than I am. I'm in this steady, that's what chronic means. I'm in this kind of steady ability to live about 20% of the capacity of the life I lived in terms of activity before I got sick. And here is this friend of mine who right now is probably down at 5%, but in another few months she'll be back up and running at 100%. And so in addition to having to adjust to this different social world, there's also just internally having to adjust to the relentlessness of the symptoms. For the first 2 years almost, I would say, I would go to bed at night and I would just say, wake up feeling well. It's like I would, at first I actually expected that of myself.
Yeah.
And then I was begging, and then it just would color my whole day. Oh, another day of feeling so awful and not being able to do things, and there's this, this relentlessness of it that, again, I've also discovered is true for so many other people. I've discovered that there are so many illnesses and conditions I had never even heard of before I wrote this book. But now people get the book and they go to the website and they find my email address, which is fine, or I wouldn't have it up there. Yep. And they write to me, and it's been an education, I have to say, because I didn't realize how many people were suffering with chronic illnesses and other disabling conditions until I wrote the book and kind of publicly entered that world.
Right. And just looking as we were talking before we started the interview, that you have a Facebook fan page, and looking at it, there was a posting that you put on there that you woke up and there were 3,999 friends, and who would be number 4,000? And by the time I got to it, it's well past that, and I just joined it myself while we were speaking, that your book and your experiences speak to a very wide range of people with a wide variety of things that they deal with on a daily basis. And one of the things I wanted to chat about briefly is you brought up this friend who's been through the accident, and right now they're not doing so well, but you know that they're going to be getting better. In fact, they'll do better than you are. But it's interesting that at this point there's a shift, and they're kind of looking to you for this support and guidance of this being temporary and you getting through it. And I equate this as very well timed to a couple of friends of mine, and one very recently within the past couple of weeks, who has been healthy and hale his entire life, and he was just diagnosed with colon cancer. And reached out to me saying, well, this is, they're going to do this surgery. And of course, he knew that I'd been through all of this before and have survived it and everything. And so we chatted, and the day after the surgery, I knew this would be a very low point for him, and called him. And up to that point had kept him laughing because it really hadn't sunk in and gone through it yet. But talking to him on the phone that day, and I made a point of calling every few days, was just very, very low, and I had to reassure him that that's okay. You should feel, you're right on course. If you feel depressed right now and you're feeling like crap, it's very appropriate. You're going to get through it. You're going to start turning around. And happily, for my dear friend who I love very much, within, 2 days, he was feeling much, much better and has gone skyrocketing in how he feels since. And even with the difference in our surgeries, he's already doing much better than I ever will again. And that's okay. I'm very happy for him. And to me, that's where I can practice that wonderful mind state of mudita, the joy in others, happiness. And what I wanted to ask is how you worked in, and having read the book, and I really do recommend it for people who not only have chronic illnesses themselves, but know people who do and they interact with on a regular basis. How did your Buddhist practice and way of looking at things help you with this?
Well, the first few years after I got sick, I have to say I felt like a failed Buddhist. I really, my entire consciousness was focused on what's wrong with me, how can I get better. I blamed myself for getting sick. I felt as if I'd ruined my husband's life. I'd let my family down. I'd let my employer down, and there was a lot of self-blame. I had really no compassion for myself. I was just angry. I thought the world was unfair. And this was after, I hate to admit it, this was 10 years into a very serious Buddhist practice. And yet that's how much something like this can just hit you. And I was helped by my husband and by Sylvia Borstein, who has over the years become more than just a Dharma teacher, but a friend, first with my husband, and then after I got sick, really with me. And she kept saying, this is not a personal failing on your part. Your body got sick. And so I gradually came back to the Buddha's teaching on suffering. And you might think, well, that's a depressing thing to do. But it was actually just what I needed. People think the First Noble Truth is depressing, but for me, it's a huge relief to understand that everybody's life has its share of joy and suffering. We're in bodies, and bodies get diseased and they get injured, like happened to my friend, and they get old. And so this is going to happen to everybody at some point, and this is what's happened to me. And it was really going back to the Buddha's teachings on suffering and kind of getting down in the trenches with it and understanding that I was hitting my head against the wall to try to deny, to keep denying and refusing what was going on with my body. And when I immersed myself in that, it actually opened the door to so many of the other Buddhist practices that bring joy into your life. That might, yeah.
It does. You're exactly right, and it's amazing that it can be these very difficult circumstances in our lives that make us take a look at the practice and viscerally understand, oh, that's it. That we may not have that opportunity to see it when things are good, when we have a good job, we're healthy, our family life we're surrounded by satisfaction. It's very enlightening, to use that word, to be faced with dissatisfaction on an inescapable level.
You know, Sylvia likes to say that this book is for everyone because because illness can be seen as a metaphor for suffering, the chronic suffering of life. And so you may not be ill, but there's still going to be suffering, whether it's trouble on the job or difficulty in a relationship or can't find your car keys, whatever it is. And that, so I just thought I would share that because she likes to say that really the book is for everyone. And I have had people tell me who aren't sick that they found they were able to relate to a lot of what I said about suffering because they see it in their own lives, even if they're not ill, and then are able. And then the book offers practices for living well.
I'm glad you brought that up.
With what you've got.
Yeah, that's it. At the end of the book, one of the most useful things I found about it is at the end of the book, you have exercises for people to do. Tell us a little bit about that section of the book.
Well, when I finished writing it, I thought, the book is written, let me go back. The book is written in terms of subjects, like there's a chapter on metta, loving kindness. There's a chapter on Zen. There's a chapter on anatta, no self, as opposed to being written based on difficulties that people face, like the relentlessness of symptoms or feeling bad because you're missing out on all the social events or handling doctors. So when I was done with the book, I looked at it and I thought, well, why don't I create a guide at the end that instead of going by topic takes up these different difficulties that people encounter and then list for them the practices in the book that they could use to help them with that difficulty. So that's really what that is at the end. Dealing with fear about the future, handling disappointments with friends, frustration in with the healthcare system. I went and I simply took those difficulties and then under them listed the various practices that people could go back to. Mm-hmm. And one person called it the emergency guide. So that's what I now call it.
So speaking of mudita, what kinds of practices have you put in the book, and do you recommend for people who are dealing with chronic illness and issues like jealousy of others and their health? How do they deal with that? How does mudita benefit them?
Well, mudita is one of what, is the four Brahma Viharas, or sometimes called the sublime states in Buddhism. And many of your listeners probably know about them. And I have a chapter in the book on each one of them. Mudita, and then metta, or loving kindness, karuna, which is compassion, and upekkha, which is equanimity. And mudita, there are different translations. The one I like is joy in the joy of others. And I've found that it was the antidote for envy for me, because envy's like, it's a poison. It's toxic, and it kind of feels like it's eating you alive sometimes. And I would hear about people, going on vacations and going to concerts and weddings, and it was at first I just would be filled with envy. And I have to say it's an ongoing practice, because it can happen, it may have even happened today, and I have to remind myself to practice mudita, which is simply to think about the experience they're going to have and cultivate joy for them. And at first, it may not feel genuine, but that's okay. I learned that from Sharon Salzberg when she talks about metta practice and how it may not feel genuine at first, but just do it. And so it didn't always feel genuine, but it gradually became that way. And so now when my husband, for example, goes to Los Angeles and visits my daughter and her family down there, I feel joy for him to the extent that it's almost as if he's there for both of us. Yeah. And so that's just a practice that's been very helpful to me.
Mm-hmm. And it is, because we don't typically practice, as I think Sharon is indicating here, at first it feels really hard and wrong because we're not feeling it sincerely. But what we're doing is taking advantage of brain plasticity and how our minds work and how we as people work, is that our practice is training our minds, and that we're changing our minds not in a light way. No, we're really physically changing the structure of our minds with our practice.
We're reconditioning ourselves.
Yeah, we are.
The Buddha talked a lot about conditioning, and so that's how I think of it, as reconditioning.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and that practice then brings about that joy that we do feel. And as with my friend who's recovering, I literally quite literally feel very happy and joyous about this
wonderful
person who's doing really well. But it takes practice to get there. We're not expected to be perfect about it. And something else I wanted to touch on, because the Brahmaviharas are it's one of my favorite topics in Buddhist thought. Is
one of your favorite lists.
It is. It's one of the favorite lists. Yeah, we got lots of lists. This is one of the best and most beneficial ones to me, in that these are things that are very valuable practices to us. In particular for this situation, I also wanted us to touch on karuna, compassion, which is a feeling of empathy for, typically it is for others in their suffering, in their hurting, and things that are going wrong in their lives. But what we don't apply it to very often, and this is a trouble with us Westerners, we need to turn this around, is we also need to have compassion for ourselves and patience for ourselves and the things we're going through. Tell us about some of the things that you recommend about karuna, compassion as a practice.
Well, when I wrote the chapter on compassion, my first thought is what everyone tends to think, which is, you're supposed to be writing about feeling compassion for others. But I found as I went to write the chapter that what I had needed was to learn to direct compassion at myself. Yeah. And that goes back to what I was saying when Sylvia Borstein was continually telling me, this is not a personal failing on your part that this happened to your body. And so I actually took a clue from the metta phrases that people learn, the loving kindness phrases, and I developed some compassion phrases to direct to my own body, like my dear sweet body working so hard to support me. And people can make up whatever phrase works for them. I have had more letters, more emails from people on that particular practice than anything else. Mm-hmm. People say, I didn't realize that I hadn't forgiven myself for getting sick. No. And just speaking those words to myself was transformational. So that's really the essence of that chapter. And there's some other practices in it too, but that's the one that has resonated the most with people.
It has. It did with me in particular as I was going through the book based on the recommendation of our friend Jan Ford, who I've had on the podcast several times, that you were writing in that section you were talking about being compassionate towards your body and those particular lines. As I was looking back on my own circumstances and having to deal with this as a child, of course I didn't have that practice. It wasn't a part of my life. So there was just a rejection and an antagonism towards my own body and how it was failing me and really screwing things up. And that another dear friend of mine who's in the Zen community here in Minneapolis, who also has dealt their whole life with chronic health issues, had used that same kind of phrasing that you did in your book, and it was just reminding me of her recommendation of, your body's been through so much, and it has been struggling to keep going on, and it's not your body's choice either. It didn't particularly want to go through this.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you have been doing that for yourself.
Yes, it took a while to get there, and for people who are listening, understand that what we talk about with patience and forgiveness for yourself is understanding that you're not expected to be perfect, that you're not expected to always be healthy, that there are circumstances outside of your control, and part of our practice is letting go of this need to have permanent stability in a self. We don't have those things, and it's only sometimes when we're faced with it very directly with things like chronic illness or personal tragedy that we really understand that. And that can be a very hard transition for us, but speaking from Toni's experience and what I've read in the book and what she's saying here and what she's heard from people is that there is tremendous joy to be had even in these horrible circumstances that we go through that we at first reject. We can find great joy in them. We can find great compassion in them. We can find wonderful states of equanimity that occur even under really hard circumstances.
I agree, and the Buddha laid it all out for us.
Yep.
So all credit to the Buddha.
Yep. Excellent. Well, one of the things I wanted to mention to the people listening to the podcast is that there is a website that has been set up. It is called www.howtobesick.com, and that's exactly how it's written. The book itself is How to Be Sick, a Buddhist-inspired guide for the chronically ill and their caregivers. Toni, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.